Hi, this is Chris Young. Welcome to episode 16 of Contemplating Life. This week we continue my multi-part series about my early childhood and my journey through the special education system. After successfully navigating kindergarten, I proceeded through the primary grades. First and second grade were uneventful experiences. I don't recall my teachers' names. I was assigned a better wheelchair than the one I had in kindergarten. The only other memorable events from that part of my life were not school-related. Both of them were painful experiences that left me bruised and sore. One Sunday afternoon in the middle of winter, my family went ice skating at Guy's Reservoir on the northeast side of Indianapolis. We were accompanied by my paternal grandparents. Apparently, ice skating was a family tradition. My dad enjoyed with them since his childhood. We had a small snow sled with a seat built into it. Dad lifted me into the sled, and we'd go skating across the ice, pulling me at high speed. I really enjoyed it till we hit a patch of rough ice just as we were making a turn. The sled tipped over and dumped me onto the ice. The result was a lot of sprained body parts and a black eye. I had interesting stories to tell the next day at school to explain the bruise. However, we never went skating again. The other incident was at a summer camp. I think it was probably between first and second grade. It was only a day camp, wasn't overnight. They held it at a facility on the east side of town called the Crossroads Rehabilitation Center. That facility still exists and is now known as Easter Seals Crossroads. Although the camp was allegedly designed to serve disabled kids, I didn't feel like they were very well equipped. For example, they didn't have a handheld urinal in the restroom like the one I used at home or at school. They had the janitor try to lift me up by grabbing me under the arms and standing me in front of the toilet to try to pee. It's the only time I ever attempted to pee standing up. Of course, my legs couldn't support any weight at all. He just had to hang me there. It was a wonder I wasn't injured. That would come later. Anyway, the next day, Mom sent me to camp with a Tupperware cup that I could pee into. Behind the building was a large playground area where the camp activities took place. And they had a regular above-ground swimming pool set up. Some of the kids would be lifted out of their wheelchairs and would get into the pool. But I was too afraid to let strangers do that. There was a wooden platform alongside the pool and a wooden ramp leading up to it. They rolled me up the ramp in my wheelchair so I could see over the edge of the pool and watch the other kids splash around. The camp counselors were everyday high school kids. They had no particular experience dealing with disabled children. The young lady who was pushing my wheelchair took me down the ramp forwards. She slipped on the wet ramp, and I went rolling forward until my front wheels hit the grass. The chair tilted forward, and I fell out and landed flat on my face. Fortunately, nothing was broken, but I had sprained ankles, knees, elbows, and shoulders. It took me more than a week to recover. During that time, recovering, I became an even bigger mama's boy than usual. I insisted on sleeping in her bed and relegating my dad to the sofa. When I finally recovered, they tried to encourage me to go back for a second session of the camp. I flatly refused. I wasn't going back to that place again. No way. Several of my disabled classmates attended an overnight, week-long summer camp called Camp Riley. Although they reassured me it was staffed by experienced and knowledgeable people, and was much better run than what I experienced at Crossroads. I never had any interest in leaving the safety of my parents' care. In fact, I never went anywhere overnight, away from my parents or grandparents, until a hospital stay in my early 20s, and then a vacation with my friend Barbara when I was 31. You'll hear all about those situations in future episodes. I always felt completely safe riding the school bus to Roberts, and safe while I was there. However, there was a serious safety issue at the school that nobody realized. Here's the backstory. I mentioned in the last episode that in kindergarten, we spent most of the afternoon in nap time. We laid on cots in the classroom. I also mentioned the entire school had an hour of post-lunch nap time, not just the kindergarten. Rather than set up cots in the classroom, the grade school kids would go down to the basement for nap time. After each lunch period, the kids would ride down the elevator to the basement, travel down a very long hallway to a large room where there were cots and beds set up. You could pack 4 wheelchairs and perhaps 2 or 3 walkers on the elevator at once. So it would take several trips to get a couple of classrooms worth of kids down to the basement. The route from the elevator to the nap room took us past the boiler room. That was where the bus drivers would hang out when they weren't driving. It was the only designated smoking area in the building. So when my mother or other parents were there working on volunteer activities, like the cookie sale, they would hang out with the bus drivers and smoke and drink coffee. Along the corridor were huge 55-gallon drums of drinking water. They were marked with a Civil Defense logo. This was the height of the Cold War, and our building was a designated fallout shelter. I seriously doubt how much protection the building would have given us. That nap room in the basement had a series of short windows high up on the back wall. Then again, we weren't exactly capable of doing that classic 50s duck and cover useless maneuver in the event of a nuclear attack. In addition to fire drills, where we would leave the building and line up on the sidewalk far away, we also had so-called security drills, in which we would ride the elevator down to the basement nap room, where the beds and cots had been conveniently folded up and put away in advance. I would have liked to see him fold up all those beds in the event of an actual emergency. Not much of a drill if you can plan ahead for it. What was supposed to be the safest room in the building was actually a death trap. This was uncovered thanks to my classmate, Charles Lynn, a walker with cerebral palsy. One day as we were returning from our nap in the basement, someone noticed there was a fire alarm button next to the elevator. None of the kids in the wheelchairs could reach high enough, but because Charlie was a walker, he could reach it. Someone gave him the dreaded double dog dare you to pull the fire alarm in the basement while we were waiting on the elevator. Now we knew it would create a stir. We had no idea it would really create a panic among the teachers. Naturally, in a fire, the elevator is off limits. Nobody ever asked, how are we going to get 20 to 30 handicapped kids out of the basement in the event of a fire? Furthermore, if there ever was a fire, one of the most likely places would be an explosion in the boiler room. As I mentioned, we passed that room en route from the elevator to the nap room. Even if the elevator was operational during a fire, the way would be blocked by the boiler room. By the way, there was a long, winding ramp connecting the first and second floors, and there were smaller ramps connecting different levels of the first floor, but there was no ramp access in or out of the basement. You'll hear more about that big ramp and the ramp between floors in future episodes. After some frantic staff meetings at the end of that day, nap time was moved to the auditorium on the ground floor. And although we never had a fire while I was there, and I don't think there ever was one in the 50 years the building was used, that stunt by Charles Lynn could have potentially saved a lot of lives by calling attention to a very dangerous situation. By the way, you might have seen Charlie. If you're a race fan who visits the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, you can see him selling newspapers. He frequently stations himself behind the grandstands on the main stretch near the entrance to the gasoline alley garage area. He also sells newspapers inside Gasoline Alley and is a popular figure with drivers and mechanics. Legendary driver A.J. Foyt, nicknamed Charlie the Wolfman. Somehow they found out one day that Charlie could do a really cool Wolfman howl. Of course, by now Charlie would be in his late 60s, like me. I don't know if he still hangs out there or not, or even if he's still around. After the stunt that Charlie pulled, we didn't have our security drills in the basement. Instead, we did what most schools did. We'd grab our coat, go out into the hallway facing a wall, and put a coat over our head. As the Cold War began to relax, security drills were renamed tornado drills. Realistically, tornadoes were a much more probable threat, and getting into the hallway away from windows was a more practical defense against tornadoes than it would have been against a nuclear conflagration. Sadly, these days kids face not only fire drills and tornado drills, they also have to endure active shooter drills. God only knows how Robert School would have handled those. Probably would have just had to lock the door and pray like most kids do. Let's face it, hiding under your desk is probably no more effective against an active shooter than it would be against a nuclear bomb. Before disabled children were integrated into regular school settings, one of the arguments against having us in regular school was it presented a safety hazard. They feared it would be difficult to evacuate the disabled kids, and/or evacuating them would slow down the evacuation of the able children. Wouldn't want to put them in harm. Just leave the kids in wheelchairs behind and let the savable kids get saved. Famed disability advocate Judy Heumann, who recently passed away at age 75, was a teacher who taught from a wheelchair. She had contracted polio as a child. She was initially denied employment because they said she couldn't help evacuate children in the case of an emergency, and/or she'd hinder their evacuation. She eventually won a court case that allowed her to teach. Later on, she worked as an advocate, and she was instrumental in the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I put articles in the description for more about her. She was an amazing woman. My third grade teacher, Miss Clara Rose Holmes, had no such difficulty being employed. She walked with a limp and had limited use of one arm as a result of polio. As a child, she had attended Robert School, and upon graduating college, she came back to teach. She was much beloved and fondly remembered by everyone who attended the school. I was sort of the teacher's pet in her classroom. She noted how bright I was, and she was happy to accelerate me through many lessons. I was doing multiplication and division, while some kids were still struggling with subtraction. She admitted that some of the work in her classroom was somewhat busy work, while most kids had to go through pages and pages of math problems every day. Once she realized I was gifted, she exempted me from some of those math drills. For grammar lessons, most kids begin the day by writing out all of their spelling words before doing any other assignment. I was similarly exempt from those drills. She concluded that such grunt work would tire me out. Truth was, my disability left me no more fatigued than any of the other kids in the class. But when the teacher says, "Oh, Chris, you're so smart. I'm not going to waste your time on all these mindless drills," I certainly wasn't going to try to dissuade her from the idea it was too hard for me physically. The end result is I can solve a logic problem with no difficulty. High school algebra, geometry, trigonometry, and a little bit of calculus, no problem for me. Unfortunately, simple arithmetic is a challenge. In high school, when I took bookkeeping, I could take a column of numbers, add them up 3 different times, and get 3 different answers. Similarly, grammar, sentence structure, writing, it all comes naturally to me. I can't spell worth a damn. One of my junior high school teachers tried to trick me into becoming a better speller. He knew I was competitive and egotistical about my intellect. He tried to persuade me to enter the spelling bee. I had laughed in his face. "You really expect me, who can't spell my way out of a paper bag, to go up against people who have a natural talent for such things? You're trying to trick me by making it a competition. Your psychological trickery isn't going to do anything to persuade me. No way I'm entering a spelling bee." Fortunately, later in life, I got into computers. Calculators, spreadsheets, spell checkers, they all compensate for my lack of skills. 2 other memorable events occurred when I was in 3rd grade. As a part of routine screening, they discovered I couldn't see. I had no idea I was nearsighted. I just thought that was as well as people could see. I was always amazed by photography, especially Polaroid instant photography. I could look at a photograph up close with my nearsighted vision and see more detail in the photo than I could when I looked at the real objects. I thought it was magical that a photograph could see more detail than I could. I got glasses when I was 8 years old, and I discovered a whole world I didn't know existed. For example, I didn't know that grass consisted of individual blades. I never got out of my wheelchair, played on the ground where I could see the grass up close. To me, the front yard just looked like a spread of fuzzy green carpet. The fact that I was a gifted student, learned to play chess at age 8, and wore glasses all completed my image as the ultimate nerd, probably before the word nerd was even coined. The other memorable event from my 3rd year of school was November 22nd, 1963. That fateful day, my mom was in the classroom hosting a party as the PTA room mother. It was a thank you party for our successful annual cookie sale. A teacher from a different classroom ran into our room and said to the adults, "Turn on the radio. There's terrible news about the president." They all listened intently, but I couldn't tell what was going on. My mom explained to me that President Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. I misunderstood what she meant by shot. I thought he'd received an inoculation. I said, "Why'd he go to Dallas? Don't they have doctors in Washington that could give him shots?" She explained to me, no, he was shot with a gun. Before the afternoon was over, we learned that the president was dead. Rather than ride the school bus home, Mom took me home herself. and tried not to cry in front of me. My family were always lifelong Democrats and Roman Catholics. My grandmother had a photograph of Kennedy on the fireplace mantel next to a photograph of the Pope. My only comment on the way home was, I guess we throw away that comedy album, The First Family. It won't be cool anymore to make fun of a dead president. I was referring to a comedy album we owned called The First Family by comedian Vaughn Meader. He did wonderful impersonations of Kennedy and the Kennedy family. I don't think we threw it away, but we never listened to it again. Decades later, I bought a copy on CD on Amazon. I listened to it one more time, just for old time's sake. We spent the next few days after the assassination glued to the TV. The following Sunday, just as we came home from church, I saw Jack Ruby shoot Lee Harvey Oswald live on NBC TV. Hey, Mom, they just shot that guy. What guy? The guy that shot the president. Somebody just shot him. If the President of the United States and the man in police custody who had shot the president were not safe, were any of us ever safe? That question persisted through all my memories of the 1960s. I remember prior to all this, watching the Today Show with my mom during the Cuban Missile Crisis and asking, Mommy, what's a blockade? I didn't know how serious the threat was. Throughout the 60s, we had the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. I was in Chicago 2 weeks before the riots at the DNC, having an ordinary vacation with my parents. What if I'd been in Chicago during the riots? What might I have seen at a young age? Things haven't changed much these days. People still live in fear. The threats are different, but the fear is the same. Even as an old white guy, the fear is still the same. Sometimes I find myself waking up in the morning thinking, I really should turn on the news, turn on the Today Show, or MSNBC. Maybe Vladimir Putin dropped a tactical nuke on Ukraine. I wouldn't even know about it if I didn't turn on the TV and find out. Those are the things that occupy us today. Not a whole lot's changed. In our next episode, we move on to 4th and 5th grade, where I got my first motorized wheelchair. And we'll talk about the diversity of the kids that attended Robert's school. If you find this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, consider sponsoring me on Patreon for just $5 a month. You'll get early access to the podcast and any other benefits I might come up with down the road. As always, my deepest thanks to my existing Patreon supporters. It's not so much about the money, but it's that you care enough about what I'm doing that you want to support me. That means more to me than I can begin to describe. Even if you can't provide financial support, I'm begging, please, 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 share links on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever social media you can, so that I can grow my audience. I just want a bigger audience. Don't really care about the money. I'll see you next week as we continue contemplating life. Until then, fly safe.